I adjusted the camera a little bit more. Let's see what I ended up with. If I select it, you'll see now I've got a focal length of 45 millimeters, and I've dollied back a little bit, so I've kind of got more of a flat composition here rather than being up close with a lot of foreshortening. And now we're ready to animate. And let's go ahead and move the ball back over to where we had it before, kind of up and over off to the side. Set it so that it's just out of the frame line here. And let's look at this in the front view. We'll dolly forward and press the 5 and then 6 keys to make sure that we've got texturing. And let's just sort of preview this effect here by moving this in the front view and kind of get a feel for where that ball is going to need to be in our shot. Okay, so that looks all right. I want to rotate the ball. Right now, it's just oriented square to the world, and that's not going to be very much fun to look at. So let's rotate it. I'll grab the rotate tool and just turn it just randomly, really. You can click in the center and you'll get a trackball-like action, or you can rotate around one axis at a time. What we want to do is we want to make it interesting so that it's not oriented to the world, but then when it actually moves through the air, we want it to spin around the world Z axis so that it will spin along its path of motion. It's going to be moving in world X and spinning around world Z. Right now, we can't make it spin around world Z because the manipulator here for the rotate tool is aligned with the object itself. All right, so let's look at the rotate tool options. Double click on the rotate tool and the tool settings window will open. I'm in fact going to tear that off as well. And you'll see rotate mode. We've got local, world, and gimbal. Local is the default. And in local mode, when you rotate the object, the axis manipulator goes with the object. It's kind of stuck to the object. In world mode, the manipulator is always lined up with the world axis. And this is actually what we want in this case. We want the object to spin around the world axis here. However, if we tried to animate in world mode here, we might have problems. The ball may not in fact spin in the direction that we want it to. And to avoid that, what we can do is we can set the local axes to line up with the world axes on frame 1 of the animation. And that's done by freezing the transforms. Okay, so right now, if I go back to local, you'll see the manipulator is not lined up with the world. And we'll see that there are a bunch of values over here. After we freeze the transforms, rotations will all be set to 0. And then we can actually use local mode, but it will act like world mode because it'll be lined up with the world by default. All right, so with the ball selected, go up to the menus and choose Modify Freeze Transformations. And if you want, you can go to the options. We want to freeze, translate, and rotate. The rest doesn't matter, but translate and rotate. And click Freeze. And now all the translate and rotate values have been set to 0. And that's the ball's new default position and orientation. And we can animate in local mode now, and it will behave predictably. We won't have any issues. All right, cool. So I'll reset that back to 0. So we've frozen the transforms. Now we're ready to animate. We've got the ball basically where we want it on frame 1. So I'll be parked on frame 1 here. Currently, I've got 120 frames in the range here. I don't need that much. Let's set it to only 48 frames. 2 seconds at 24 frames per second. And we'll go ahead and set some keyframes. Before we do, let's lock down everything so that things don't move around. I'll go back to the outliner, window outliner, and I'll select the plane, the environment, open up the camera group, and holding down Control and selecting camera 1 and camera 1 aim. I just want to lock down everything except for the ball so that I can't accidentally move anything. So I'll go over here to the channel box, drag my mouse across all of these channels. And from the Channels menu, choose Channels, Lock Selected. And once I've done that, now I can't move or rotate any of these objects, even if I try. And you will see that when I select an object, for example, with the Move tool, the Move manipulator is grayed out. For the ball, I don't want to lock all the channels. I only want to lock the ones that are not going to be animated. I know that I'm going to animate in translate X, or the X position. I know that I'm going to animate in translate Y, or Y position. And I know that I'm going to rotate around Z. But everything else can be locked. So I'll unselect those three. Unselect translate X, unselect translate Y, and unselect rotate Z. And then lock all the rest. Channels, lock selected. Then I'll just restore these back to 0. All right, so now we're pretty much set up to do our animation. I'm on frame 1 of the timeline. Let's close the outliner. And we can keyframe the objects. We might as well rename them while we're here, though. Let's rename this. I'll call this one ball. Call this ground plane. All right, so to create our first keyframe, select the ball and make sure that we're parked on frame 1 and simply press the S key on the keyboard. And when I do that, I see that the unlocked channels now highlight in red. And that indicates that there's an incoming animation curve node. There's keyframe data on that channel. And with the ball still selected, we can see, in fact, that there's a red line here on frame 1, and that is the keyframe. All right, so we can go now to frame 24 and position the ball near the ground. We don't need to be terribly careful about it being exactly on the ground because we're going to add a squash deformer on this later, so we'll have to come back here and adjust this. So if it's near the ground, that's good enough. And go ahead and press the S key again. And if we scrub in the timeline here, we can see that the ball's actually moving. Okay, we'll go back down to frame 48 to the end, and then position the ball so that it's out of frame on the right. And once again, press the S key. Let's see what we've got so far. I'll click in the camera view to highlight it, and then rewind and play back. And what we see here is that it's playing at a very high rate of speed. Now, depending upon how complicated your scene is, Maya may play back faster or slower. Because this is a very simple scene, it's playing back at very high rate of speed. We need to constrain that rate of speed so that it does not exceed the current time base, which is 24 frames per second. We can also check in on how fast it is actually playing back by turning on the heads-up display. Go up to the display menu and choose heads-up display frame rate. And now in the bottom right corner of each viewport, we see a readout. And when we play back, we shall see that this is playing back at a very high rate of speed. Okay, so somewhere around 300 frames per second. Now let's constrain that frame rate. We do that by going into the animation preferences. Click on this little button down here, and that's a shortcut that will take us directly to the animation timeline preferences. And here we are. Scroll down here a little bit. You'll see playback speed is set to play every frame, and max playback speed is set to free. That means that Maya will not skip any frames in a heavy scene. Sometimes if you have a complicated scene, Maya cannot actually play it back at your desired frame rate. And so you have two options here, either skip frames or play every frame. And if it's set to real time here, then it'll skip frames in a heavy scene. We usually want to leave it at play every frame. That way we'll be able to see all of the action and frames don't get skipped. Down here you'll see max playback speed, and it's set to free by default in this version of Maya. I'm going to change that to real time. And now we won't skip any frames in a heavy scene, but we won't go faster than the current time base in a lightweight scene. And additionally, while I'm here, I'm going to set update view to all. And with that enabled, it won't matter which panel has focus. We will see the animation playback in all the viewports. All right, so click Save to save our preferences and play once again. And we can see now that it's playing at a normal rate of speed. But there is one little glitch here, which you will see the frame rate down here is not accurate. And that's because we're in a 4 viewport layout. Just one of the glitches of Maya. If I maximize that camera view and play it back, now that frames per second readout is in fact accurate. And we're playing back at 24 frames per second. All right, cool. It's very important that you check in on your playback speed, because if it's off by just a little bit, you won't notice it. If your scene is playing back at 40 frames per second instead of 24, you might not realize it, and then you do a bunch of animation, and then you come back later and render it, and it looks like it's playing at the wrong speed when it's rendered. Well, in fact, it was at the wrong speed when you animate it. So sometimes that can trip you up. So I recommend that when animating, always have the frame rate enabled in the heads-up display, and also always make sure that your playback speed is play every frame max real time. And in fact, there's a handy shortcut for that. If you right-click on the timeline, you can go to playback speed, and there it is there. Play every frame max real time. Cool, so that's a good place for us now to save a new version. File, increment, and save.